Out here where the ice never melts and silence stretches for miles, the rules of the wild seem clear: survive or vanish. But one morning along a frozen stretch of the Dalton Highway in northern Alaska, something broke that rule. A driver slowed, not because of a snowdrift or a fallen tree, but because two white shapes were lying still on the tundra just beyond the road's edge. One was unmoving, the other was watching. From a distance, it could have been debris from a freight truck, maybe an abandoned tarp or lump of snow. But then the shape lifted its head. A polar bear. And she wasn't alone. Pressed close to her side was a smaller figure, barely breathing, nearly buried by wind-blown ice. The driver could have kept going. Most people would. But he stopped. And what unfolded next wasn't just rare. It was something no wildlife camera, no documentary crew, no scientific journal had ever truly captured. This isn't a story about predators. It's not a rescue video with a happy tune and a quick fade-out. It's a story about protection, about devotion that defies instinct, and a moment so raw, so real it made even the coldest landscape feel warm. Because when a polar bear mother refuses to leave her injured cub, even as danger creeps closer, even as hope thins with every passing minute, you start to wonder, what does love look like when no one's watching? Let me take you there. Franklin Hayes hadn't planned to be out that far. Not this time of year, not at his age. 68 winters had passed over him, many of them spent repairing oil transport routes or checking radar towers, long since decommissioned. Now retired, he mostly stayed near Fairbanks, where life was easier on the knees. But old habits are hard to quit. When the cold settled in just right and the roads turned quiet, Franklin would drive north, not for a reason, but for something else he couldn't name. That morning, the Dalton Highway was empty as usual. No tourists, no convoys, just the hum of Franklin's rust-stained truck and the distant rhythm of tires over frost-heaved asphalt. He was headed toward Tulik, a place he used to check radio signal boxes, now just a dot on the map with more wolves than people. Around mile marker 245, just past a bend, flanked by jagged black rocks and wind-scrubbed snow, he saw something strange. It didn't stand out. That was the eerie part. Two pale forms low to the ground, unmoving. At first glance, it looked like chunks of ice dislodged by a snowplow. But Franklin's eyes were trained. Years on the ice had taught him how to spot the subtle breaks in landscape that meant danger or something worth stopping for. He eased off the gas. The truck grumbled in protest as it rolled to a stop, tires crunching into frozen gravel. He cut the engine and let the silence settle. Then he saw it. The first shape wasn't moving, but the second was alive. Barely. A massive white bear, thick-coated, scarred at the shoulder, her head lifted just enough to scan the road. Franklin stayed in the truck, not out of fear, out of respect. Polar bears weren't like black bears or even grizzlies. You didn't just walk up to them, especially not a mother. And not when there was a cub involved. But this one wasn't behaving like she should have. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't growl or stand or bluff charge. She stayed low, her body curled slightly around the smaller figure beside her, a cub, Franklin realized, still as the ice itself. The cub wasn't sleeping. He was injured. One leg twisted at an odd angle, fur stiffened with dried blood nostrils, barely flaring. And the mother, she was guarding him like a stone wall, her eyes following Franklin's every move unblinking. He didn't dare step out. He didn't reach for his camera. What he did was reach for his phone. The signal was weak, just one bar flickering. But it was enough to get through to the Arctic Wildlife Field Center, a small outpost that handled injured seabirds, trapped foxes, and once a sedated musk ox. Franklin knew someone there. Had met her once during a training about road hazard wildlife reports. Dr. Elise Monroe. She picked up after 2 rings. "Hayes," she asked, voice scratchy through the cold connection. "I need you out past Tulik, now. Polar bear. Cubs down. Mother's staying." Silence. "Send coordinates," Elise said. "Do not approach." Franklin stayed in the truck, watching. The sun was crawling low across the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow. The wind had quieted, and in that strange hush he could hear the faintest sounds from across the road. Breathing, the mother's shallow, rhythmic, the cub's uneven. He whispered aloud to no one. She should have run, because that's what bears do. They don't linger near roads. They avoid humans. Especially mothers with cubs, they'll either flee or fight. But this one, she stayed. She pressed her massive body tighter around the cub, angling herself slightly to block the wind. There's a kind of reverence that settles in moments like this, when the laws of nature don't behave the way you expect, when something wild acts with patience, with emotion, with what almost looks like choice. Franklin thought about his son, lost at 18 to the ice. Fell through a patch on a frozen lake one winter. Franklin had tried to save him, ran for help, broke his ribs punching at the ice, but it was too late. Maybe that's why he stayed now. Maybe this was his penance. Or maybe he just knew that some lives are too precious to leave alone. He didn't know how long he had waited. An hour, maybe 2. No other cars passed, no movement from the bears. But eventually he heard the chopping sound of rotor blades against the thin Arctic air. A wildlife medevac helicopter, painted in pale blue, dropped toward the road's edge, stirring up plumes of snow. Elise stepped out tall and brisk, wearing a parka patched with rescue badges from 10 different wildlife regions. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just nodded at Franklin through the windshield and walked with a practiced slowness toward the snowfield. She kept her body low, no sudden movements. One tranquilizer rifle over her shoulder, another team member trailing with a collapsible carrier. Franklin cracked his window just enough to hear. "Hey, Mama," Elise said, her voice low, clear. "You've done enough. Let me help." The polar bear raised her head but didn't move. No growl, no warning, only a sound, a low rumble somewhere between a purr and a whimper. Elise stepped closer. She didn't lift the rifle, didn't aim. She crouched her hands open. That's when the mother nudged the cub forward with her snout. Just slightly. Enough to say, "I'm not leaving him, but I'll let you try." What followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, careful, and full of something people don't often attribute to wild animals' trust. The cub, later named Kai by Elise's team, was sedated gently and loaded into the carrier. The mother bear, Sable, watched the whole time. When Elise backed away, Sable stepped forward and sniffed the open second carrier. She didn't run, didn't fight. She climbed in. Franklin watched the doors close. The blades started again. The helicopter rose, carrying both mother and cub away. And he didn't know why, but for the first time in years, Franklin wept. Not because he was sad, but because something wild had let him witness something real. A decision. A surrender. A kind of love that didn't need words. He sat there long after the helicopter disappeared, staring at the space they'd left behind. 2 shallow impressions in the snow, one large, one small, facing each other. Later, he'd be asked why he stopped. What made him pull over on a day when no one else was around? He didn't have a scientific answer, just a feeling. "I knew she wasn't going to leave," he said, "and I figured maybe I wasn't supposed to either." There are moments when the wild doesn't just survive, it chooses. Moments when animals do things that shake our understanding of what's instinct and what's emotion, of what's learned and what's simply known. This was one of those moments. But the real story wasn't just on the road. It was what happened after. Because love may begin in stillness, but healing, that happens when we choose to stay. Sable didn't come from a sanctuary. She wasn't tagged, tracked, or part of any study. No camera crew had followed her through the ice fields. She was just a mother, one of the thousands of polar bears wandering the northern rim of Alaska, surviving between the sea ice and the shrinking shorelines. But the way she stayed beside her injured cub defied what most people, even scientists, expect from wild animals. When the helicopter landed at the Arctic Wildlife Field Center and the carriers were carefully rolled inside, Dr. Elise Monroe didn't say much. She was focused. Every move was precise. One carrier held Kai still, sedated, his leg limp, shallow breath audible. The other carried Sable, alert now, but strangely still, like she'd accepted her fate, or maybe understood something no one could prove. Most polar bear mothers, when threatened, flee if they can. If cornered, they fight. But in every recorded step of this story, Sable chose a third path. She stayed. Later, Elise would say, "I've seen a lot of things in the field. I've watched animals do incredible things to survive. But I've never seen one refuse to leave their young, even when escape was an option." It made her pause. Not just as a vet, but as a scientist. Why did Sable stay biologically polar bears? Ursus maritimus are solitary by design. Aside from the mating season and the months following cub birth, they spend much of their lives alone. The Arctic doesn't lend itself to social behavior. Food is scarce. Temperatures are brutal. Energy must be conserved. A polar bear mother, after giving birth in a den during the late winter, emerges hungry, weak, and determined. She has to teach her cubs how to survive quickly, how to hunt, how to swim, how to sense danger. But she's always calculating risk. If something threatens her cubs and there's no chance of winning, she's programmed to run, because survival means she might raise another litter one day. But sometimes instinct isn't the whole story. Sable's choice to stay beside Kai, injured, helpless, vulnerable, wasn't just unusual. It was deliberate. She didn't posture. She didn't panic. She positioned her body to shelter his, placed a paw across his side, and refused to move. In the days that followed their arrival at the center, Elise observed her closely. She expected stress behaviors, pacing, aggression, and vocalizations. But Sable was silent, not frozen, just watchful. When Kai whimpered post-surgery, Sable let out soft chuffs, low vibrations that rolled from her chest like echoes through snow. And Kai responded. He'd lift his head, nudge toward the sound. They were communicating clearly, gently. It wasn't instinct. It was something else. Scientists like to separate behavior into categories: survival, mating, feeding, and threat response. But what happens when an animal does something not easily explained? When a mother chooses to risk everything? Exposure, exhaustion, even starvation, not to escape, but to protect a cub who, by all odds, should not have made it. There's a growing body of research exploring this very question. In 2016, a study published in Biology Letters documented a wild polar bear who remained beside her deceased cub for nearly 2 days, returning to the site repeatedly after storms. Other reports describe bears calling softly to missing cubs, retracing steps for miles. These aren't strategies, they're expressions. So what do we call that? Some say it's anthropomorphism, to assign emotion to animals. Others argue it's proof that the bonds we cherish in our own lives may not be so unique after all. For Elise, the evidence was in Sable's stillness, in her gaze, in how she never turned away from Kai's side even when the vet techs came in with injections or warm towels. Even when doors clanged or humans whispered too loudly. She watched, listened, adapted, but never fled. And over time, something changed in the room. The air softened. Even the techs, hardened by years of working with unpredictable wildlife, began to whisper around her. They placed the food closer. They moved more slowly. One volunteer, a retired school teacher named Helen, began reading aloud during observation hours, saying the quiet voice seemed to soothe them both. It became clear this wasn't just a rescue story. It was a living moment of connection. And everyone in that clinic could feel it. Franklin came to visit on the 4th day. He stood quietly behind the glass, hat in hand. Elise joined him, arms crossed. "She's still not eating much," he said. "No," Elise replied. "But she watches everything, especially when we touch him. She trusts you. I don't think she trusts me. I think she's choosing to wait. Choosing to believe it's worth it." That word, choosing, mattered. Because it reframed everything. Sable wasn't a passive subject. She wasn't a rescued dog or a zoo animal. She was a wild creature making real-time decisions in an unnatural place. And her decisions, stay close, protect, observe, were shaping the way the team treated her in return. It raised a powerful question. If an animal raised in the harshest ecosystem on Earth can express patience, loyalty, even gentleness, what does that say about what we're missing when we reduce wildlife to instinct and data? Elise believed it said a lot. People think the wild is all teeth and hunger, she told her team one night. But maybe it's also shelter. Maybe it's memory. She began recording Sable and Kai's interactions. Not for science journals, though they were valuable, but for something deeper, a kind of archive. A record of what it looked like when love wasn't domesticated. The footage showed Sable shifting her body to block light from Kai's eyes as he slept. It showed her humming when he cried, pressing her head against his carrier when they were separated for treatments. These weren't reflexes. These were rituals. And they echoed the behaviors of other species long known for deep bonds. Orcas, for instance, carry their deceased calves for days. Elephants mourn their dead with rituals. Even birds like the albatross remain monogamous and co-parent for life. Polar bears, it seems, might belong in that quiet club of emotional architects. But if that's true, if wild animals are more than survival machines, then what does that mean for how we protect them? It's a question Elise often pondered at the end of long days. It's easy to write grants for endangered species. Easier still to raise money with dramatic rescue clips and viral animal videos. But it's harder to explain that what we're protecting isn't just a body or a population, it's a capacity. The ability of animals like Sable to feel, to choose, to wait. Maybe that's what Sable was teaching all of them. Not just about polar bears, but about attention, about patience, about what it means to be present with someone who's hurting. As Kai's condition stabilized, the next challenge emerged: where could they go next? A mother who wouldn't leave. A cub too familiar with humans to be released. A bond too delicate to break. Elise stood by their enclosure one morning, coffee in hand. Outside, the wind scraped the windows with ice. Inside, Sable and Kai lay pressed together, breathing in time. "He's getting stronger," said one tech. "And she's still here," Elise replied. "Do you think she'll stay like this forever?" Elise looked at the bear. "I think she'll stay until she doesn't have to." When Franklin Hayes hung up the phone, Dr. Elise Monroe didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for a photo, a second opinion, or a better signal. She just said, "Send me your coordinates," and reached for her emergency bag. She'd gotten calls before. Ravens tangled in fishing lines, foxes hit by snowmobiles, even a caribou calf once caught in barbed wire. But polar bears were different, not just because of their size or strength, but because of what they represented. Power, isolation, survival. And yet, as Elise slid her tranquilizer rifle into its case and checked the injector pressure, she felt something else stirring, a kind of quiet dread. Not because of the risk, but because of what Franklin had said. "She's not moving." That phrase played in her mind over and over as she climbed into the helicopter. Bears didn't just stay. Not near humans, not on the edge of roads, not with helicopters inbound, unless they were trapped or choosing something more powerful than fear. The pilot, Cam, gave her a quick nod as they lifted off. "Where are we headed, Tulik?" "North Slope," Elise replied. "He said it's just off the Dalton. Female polar bear. Injured cub." Cam let out a low whistle. "That's rare." Very. The flight was just over an hour. But in Elise's head it stretched longer. She mentally reviewed the field protocols, polar bear sedation windows, wine drift on darts, and dosage per weight estimates. She checked the ketamine, the tyletamine, and the antibiotics. Checked again. But more than the gear, it was the memory of the last time she'd dealt with a polar bear cub that haunted her. 3 years ago, a female cub was brought in, emaciated mother nowhere in sight. The team did everything right. Fed her, gently kept her warm, avoided imprinting. She was released 3 months later with a tracking collar. But the signal went dark after 8 days. They never found her again. Elise still remembered the sound the cub had made when the transport cage was opened, the hesitation, the confusion. It had haunted her ever since. So this time, with both mother and cub alive, she knew the margin for error was thin. If they lost the cub, the mother might stop eating. If they stressed the mother, she might lash out or flee and never be seen again. And if she died, the cub wouldn't last long. This wasn't just a medical situation, it was a bond, a delicate, invisible thread between two lives that had to be preserved without either fully understanding what was happening. As the helicopter neared the site, Cam circled once, giving Elise a clear view. Franklin's truck was a speck against the white. Beside it, two pale shapes closer than she expected, side by side near a patch of wind-scoured gravel. She looked through her binoculars. The adult was upright, alert, not pacing. The cub was flat, one leg extended unnaturally. Elise inhaled slowly. She's still with him. Cam set them down 150 feet from the pair. The wind kicked up snow, but neither bear moved. Elise stepped out with care, keeping her profile, low voice soft. Let's take it slow. They approached in silence, the crunch of boots muffled by snow. When Elise got within 40 feet, she stopped. The mother turned her head. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Elise saw something she'd only ever read about, not panic, not aggression, but something close to grief. The mother didn't growl, didn't bluff or threaten. She just looked. And that's when Elise spoke. "You've done all you can," she said quietly. "Let me help now." She raised the tranquilizer rifle slowly, not at the mother, but at the cub. A light dart, fast and low. The cub flinched but didn't cry out. Seconds later, his breathing slowed. Then Elise turned to the mother. She didn't move. "Okay, sweetheart," Elise murmured. "You can come too." They opened the second crate. Left it nearby, no sudden gestures, and after a long minute the mother walked in on her own. No force, no fear, just trust. Back in the chopper, Elise couldn't stop glancing at the crates. The cub, Kai, lay curled in blankets. The mother Sable pressed her nose against the mesh between them. Every few seconds she made a low hum barely audible above the blades. Kai stirred once in response. "They're still talking to each other," Elise said. Cam nodded. Never seen anything like that, neither had she. Back at the field center, Elise didn't sleep that night. Not really. She checked on Kai every hour, reapplied heat packs, monitored vitals, adjusted fluids. The cub had a fractured femur, shallow internal bleeding, and signs of dehydration, but he was stable, for now. Meanwhile, Sable refused food. She paced once, then sat beside the door to Kai's room. When Elise moved him to the surgical wing, Sable paced again, letting out that same humming sound. "She won't rest until she sees him again," one tech said. "She's holding him in her mind," Elise replied, "the way we do." And then it hit her. This wasn't just biology. This was a belief. Sable believed her cub was still alive, still near. And she was willing to wait until he returned, even if nothing in her environment made sense anymore. That realization shifted something in Elise. For years, she'd prided herself on clean science, tracking cortisol levels, documenting behavioral changes. But what she was witnessing now didn't belong on a spreadsheet. It belonged in the realm of story, of connection. And maybe that's what changed her approach. She started speaking softly during check-ins. Let Sable see her tending to Kai, placed Kai's used bedding near Sable's enclosure, played recordings of his breathing at night. Anything to keep the thread between them intact. Because this wasn't just about saving a cub anymore. It was about honoring the bond that had kept them both alive through one of the harshest ecosystems on Earth. There was one moment Elise would never forget. It was 3:12 a.m. She was wrapping Kai's hind leg after setting the bone. He was still sedated. The room was quiet except for the soft rhythm of machines. And then from the other side of the wall came a sound, a low, drawn-out hum. Sable. Elise paused, and in that moment Kai exhaled softly, almost like he'd heard her. "I think he knows," Elise whispered. "She's still there, not just in scent or sound, but in something deeper, presence." And it reminded Elise of something she'd once read during vet school. a line scribbled in the margin of an old behavioral biology book. What we don't understand isn't less real, it's just waiting for us to pay attention. She never forgot that line again. Because Sable had reminded her that science can explain the body, but love needs to be witnessed. The snow had started to fall again by the time the team arrived. Fine, dry flakes that disappeared as soon as they touched skin. They made the landscape look softer, quieter, like it was trying to cushion what was about to happen. Elise stepped off the helicopter first. She didn't rush. She never did. Everything about her was deliberate, measured, but not cold. She walked with the experience of someone who'd moved between wild animals in danger more times than she could count. And yet, what she saw when she stepped toward that motionless white pair still caught her off guard. Sable hadn't moved. Even with the sound of blades, the approach of strangers, and the sharp scent of humans in the wind, she stayed. Her body coiled protectively around Kai, the injured cub. She lifted her head slightly, just enough to show she saw them, but not enough to leave. And in that small act, Elise felt the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a negotiation. She motioned for the rest of the team to hang back. The dart gun was loaded but held low. Elise approached in a wide arc, keeping her eyes' soft posture low. No sudden movements, no direct stare, just calm, slow breathing one step at a time. 20 yards out, she stopped. Sable watched. "Kai's in trouble," Elise said softly, though the words were more for herself than the bear. "And you know it." The plan had been clear. Sedate the mother first, then the cub. But plans often shift when the wild decides otherwise. And Sable, she wasn't behaving like any mother bear Elise had ever seen. No aggression, no retreat, just waiting. Elise made a call. "We go for the cub first," she whispered into her radio. "She won't leave him, not yet." The dart struck with a light hiss so quiet it barely registered above the breeze. Kai didn't flinch. His body was already too weak. Within seconds, the sedative began working. Shallow breath turned rhythmic, limbs relaxed. Elise moved quickly now, gloves on, blanket ready, vitals checked in less than a minute. The hardest part was lifting him. As soon as Elise cradled Kai's body, Sable's head rose higher. Her ears twitched. A low sound escaped her throat, not a growl, not a roar, but something deep and hollow, like grief barely held back. Elise froze. "It's okay," she said gently, making eye contact for just a second. "I'm not taking him away, I'm bringing him home." Then came the most unexpected thing of all. Sable stood. Walked forward, not toward Elise, but toward the open carrier waiting behind them. She paused beside it, sniffed the inside, looked back at her cub, and stepped in. Just like that. No dart, no coaxing, no push. She chose. The team stood stunned for a breath too long before snapping into action. Elise secured Kai inside one carrier, while another volunteer quietly closed the second behind Sable. The helicopter loaded quickly. Franklin, still standing by his truck hat in hand, watched in silence. As the blades picked up speed, Elise glanced back at him through the open side door. He gave a small nod. It was all he needed to say. In flight, Elise sat between the carriers, watching them both. Kai swaddled in heat packs, chest rising and falling. Sable pressed against the mesh wall that separated her from her son, her body still. Not asleep, not panicked, just present. She let out that sound again. The low hum. Elise had heard it before, once from a rescued grizzly with a dying cub, and again from a lioness at a sanctuary in Nevada calling for her kitten who'd been pulled for emergency vet care. It wasn't language, but it was communication, and somehow Kai stirred in his sleep, a twitch of the ear. A small breath deeper than the last. "They're talking," Elise whispered. Back at the center, the transition from flight to treatment happened fast. Kai was rushed to surgery, fractured femur, internal bruising, signs of blood loss. His survival depended on speed. Sable remained in her carrier, watching everything, her ears perked with every metallic click, her nose pressed to the door every time a new scent drifted in. Elise didn't leave Kai's side. 2 hours in surgery, bones set, fluids stabilized, antibiotics administered. One assistant asked if it was safe to bring the mother in. Elise didn't hesitate. She needs to see him. They moved Kai, still sedated, into a recovery enclosure, carried Sable's crate nearby, opened the door. She stepped out slowly, sniffed the air, took one look at her cub, and went straight to him. Not cautiously, not suspiciously, but with the precision of a mother who had never once questioned where he'd gone. She lay down beside him. He pressed his body to his, groomed the fur behind his ears, hummed again and again. Everyone in the room stood still. "She didn't have to come with us," Elise whispered. "She could have run, but she didn't." "Why do you think one tech asked?" "Because she made a choice. And we don't talk about that enough. Most wildlife stories center around survival. Predator chases prey. The animal gets injured. Human steps in. Cue rescue rehab release. It's a formula that works, but it flattens everything. It assumes animals act only on instinct, that they're unaware of outcomes, that they don't in some small way decide. But Sable's actions didn't follow the formula. She didn't abandon her cub, didn't attack the humans. She didn't just let the rescue happen. She shaped it. That changes things. For years, polar bears have been painted as powerful but emotionless, solitary, cold. But what happens when one shows us something different? Something gentle, something that refuses to leave. It asks us to look again. Elise began documenting the entire process, not just for medical records, but to ask new questions. What happens to a wild animal's behavior when it chooses connection over fear? What if trust is possible, not just with food or training, but through presence? Sable wasn't a trained bear. She wasn't hand-fed. She wasn't domesticated. But she stayed beside her cub, not because she was trapped, but because she believed that where he was where she belonged. That's not survival. That's devotion. And the deeper question, the one Elise couldn't stop turning over in her mind, was this: how many moments like this have we missed? Out in the forests, the ice, the quiet places where cameras don't reach and humans don't linger. How many mothers have waited beside fallen cubs while no one was watching? Because what this moment reminded everyone in that clinic, techs, vets, volunteers, even the pilot who returned to check on them days later, is that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to leave. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of love there is. The recovery room was kept cold, not Arctic cold, but cold enough to mimic the world Sable and Kai had come from. Elise always insisted on that. Polar bears don't heal in warmth. Their bodies respond to chill like a second language, and too much heat makes everything harder, rest-breathing metabolism. So the vents hummed low and steady. The light stayed dim. The floor was lined with insulated pads, but nothing in the clinic could replicate the wild. That's why Sable hadn't slept. 3 days had passed since the rescue. Kai had been through surgery twice. The first to set the fractured femur, the second to stabilize internal bleeding they hadn't seen in the initial scans. He was breathing now. Barely. A slow rhythm interrupted by the occasional twitch. Elise called it a good sign. His brain's still talking to his body, she explained. But Sable wasn't watching monitors. She was watching him. She refused to eat. The techs had tried everything: fat-rich fish blubber strips, even raw seal meat imported from an Alaskan tribal partnership. She didn't growl or turn away. She just sat at the edge of the enclosure, eyes fixed on her cub body, unmoving for hours. No pacing, no sleeping, no sound except for the low hum that had become her signature, soft vibrating barely there. And Kai, in his unconscious state, responded. Not every time, but enough. His ears would twitch, his paw would shift. One time his lips curled slightly like a reflex smile from some memory she was calling back into him. "I've never seen anything like it," said Lani, a vet assistant who had worked with big cats for 10 years. "It's like she's holding him here, with sound." Elise nodded. "That's not a hum. It's a tether. Somewhere between instinct and devotion, Sable was doing what no human could. She was refusing to let him go. It raised a deeper question, one Elise hadn't asked aloud yet. How much did animals know about the edge between life and loss? Scientists will tell you that mother polar bears fast for months when they have cubs. They emerge from dens exhausted, nearly starving, focused only on teaching survival. If a cub dies, they move on. That's what the textbooks say. But Sable wasn't moving on. She was leaning in. Each time the team entered the room to check Kai's vitals, clean his wounds, or adjust the IV line, Sable would watch their every move. She never lunged, never snarled, just tracked every hand, every breath. And if the door closed before she could sniff him, she'd emit that low hum again, one note longer than the rest. A sound Elise later described as grief mixed with instruction. Because it didn't feel like mourning, it felt like communication. And that's what changed the team's entire approach. Instead of separating them, they moved Kai's cot into the enclosure. It was a risk, but a measured one. The cot had bars on one side, wheels on the other, and enough room for Sable to approach without harming him. They placed it near the corner she favored, laid fresh snow on the floor, doused the walls with seal oil scent. Then they opened the door. Sable stepped in. She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She walked slowly, deliberately, and curled her body around his cot like a shield. Her head rested just below his injured leg. Her breath synced with his, and for the first time since arrival, she slept. A full, undisturbed sleep. That night, Elise sat outside the glass wall, coffee in hand, watching. She thought about her first year in wildlife medicine, when she believed animals were defined by patterns, not personalities. That bears hunted humans, rescued, and instincts ruled all. But now, years and dozens of rescues later, she had learned the most surprising behavior wasn't rage or aggression. It was loyalty. Loyalty without reward, without explanation, without a script. She remembered a moment from her childhood watching her grandfather's dog sleep beside his hospital bed for 3 days without moving. No commands, no training, just presence. And here across a pane of glass, a wild polar bear was doing the same. Franklin came back the next morning. He stood quietly as always, wore the same flannel shirt. He brought no questions, only a thermos of tea and a note. The note read, "For the mother who stayed." Elise placed it on the observation desk next to a growing collection of notes from staff volunteers, even visitors who'd heard about Sable and Kai through word of mouth. A local paper had picked up the story. A wildlife photography blog had posted a grainy shot of the pair from the highway, and now people wanted to know more. Will he walk again? Will she go back to the wild? Will they stay together? The team didn't have answers yet. Kai's progress was slow. He was responsive now, opening his eyes, shifting his head, licking at snow. But his back leg remained weak, and the stress of relocation could reverse everything. And Sable. She wouldn't leave his side. Not for food, not for rest, not even for herself. Which led to the dilemma Elise couldn't ignore anymore. What comes next in a perfect world? Kai would recover fully. They'd be released on stable sea ice. They'd resume their path as wild animals. But the truth wasn't so simple. Kai was imprinted now, at least partially. He knew the scent of humans, the rhythm of indoor lights, and the sound of medical machines. And more importantly, he relied on proximity to safety, to warmth, to a kind of protection the wild might not offer anymore. And Sable, she had made her choice once, to stay, to follow, to trust. But would she survive if forced to fend for them both again? It was a question that blurred lines between biology and ethics, between conservation and care, between the role of science and the role of story. Because this wasn't just a polar bear cub in a recovery room. This was a family. a bond. And like many families, they didn't fit into the systems built for easy labels. One night, Lani asked Elise, "What if we've saved them, but can't release them?" Elise answered quietly, "Then maybe saving means something different this time. Because not all rescues lead back to the wild. Some lead to places we build with new rules, where animals aren't owned but respected, where instincts are honored but bonds are protected, where a mother and cub can roam not in cages but in carefully curated spaces that feel like forests, like sea ice, like home." That idea was forming already. Quietly, a plan. A property. Elise had north of the center 12 acres of tundra-lined fencing used for rehab in past years. She hadn't opened it in a while. But maybe now was the time. Maybe what Sable and Kai needed wasn't release. Maybe it was refuge, a place where they could stay together. Be wild, but not unsafe. Be free, but still seen. A place where devotion like this didn't have to be sacrificed for protocol. A place where healing could continue without a deadline. By the third week, Kai could walk, not far, and not gracefully. His back leg still wobbled. Muscles slow to rebuild, but he was mobile. He followed Sable around the enclosure like a satellite, limping slightly, leaning in when he tired. She never moved too fast. She adjusted for him, step by step, like a mother guiding a toddler learning how to stand again. For the staff at the Arctic Wildlife Field Center, it should have been a moment of celebration, but instead it brought a quiet weight. Because now came the question no one wanted to answer. What next? In most wildlife rescues, the goal is simple. Return the animal to the wild. Restore their freedom. But as Kai's health improved and Sable's bond remained unbreakable, that plan became less and less clear. They couldn't just open a gate and let them go. Kai wasn't ready, not just physically but behaviorally. He had spent crucial weeks during his development surrounded by human voices, light patterns, and feeding routines. No one had touched him unnecessarily. No one had hand-fed him, but even so his rhythms were now different. He waited when the light clicked on. He lifted his head when Elise entered the room. He didn't flinch at doors or boots. That meant his survival instincts were blunted. And Sable. She was no longer just a mother in the wild. She had crossed a line most apex predators never cross. She had walked into a career by choice. She had waited patiently in a clinic. She had accepted the scent of antiseptic, the quiet beeping of monitors, tanty presence of people near her cub. She had adapted, and in doing so, she had changed. Now, to release them into the raw wilderness again would be not only dangerous, it might be a death sentence. So Elise began thinking differently. Not about release, but about the return. Return not to the wild, but to something close. Something that honored who they were, but recognized what they'd become. It started as a sketch on a napkin, 12 acres of land she hadn't used in nearly 5 years. Her father had built it as a temporary rehab site for injured wolves and caribou land, wrapped in reinforced fencing hidden behind a line of dwarf birch and glacial runoff. It was close enough to the coast to stay cold, far enough from town to be safe. And it had something even rarer, solitude. She drove out the following morning. Snow still lined the path. The fencing held firm. Some of the shelters were collapsed under wind-blown drifts, but the bones were there. Strong, simple, wild enough to feel free, controlled enough to keep them protected. Later that evening, she brought it up with the team. Sanctuary, Lani asked. Not the zoo kind, not the watch-through glass kind. This would be theirs. No signs, no tours, just room. They'd never be touched again. No one touches them now. That wouldn't change. Franklin, who had returned that week to deliver fresh supplies and a second donation, said nothing at first. Then he simply nodded. "It's not the world they were born into," he said. "But it's the world that stayed when the other one let them down." And that idea stuck. Because wild isn't always where you came from. Sometimes it's what's left when everything else has fallen away. The transition took 10 days. Volunteers showed up quietly, former interns, local rangers, even a couple of photographers who'd once documented Arctic foxes with Elise. No one filmed, no one posed for the press. They cleared snow, rebuilt feeding platforms, and restored the pond pump for drinking water. They carried logs to recreate climbing structures, hauled ice blocks to simulate shifting terrain. The fencing was checked, reinforced, and buried 6 feet underground to prevent digging wildlife from entering or exiting. And Sable and Kai. They waited. They didn't know the plan, but they knew something was coming. The energy changed in the clinic, less monitoring, more movement, less urgency, more preparation. On the 12th morning, Elise opened the transfer crate and stood back. Sable stepped out first. She didn't hesitate. Her nose lifted, catching the scent of pine ice and bird feathers carried on the breeze. Then she turned to the crate and waited. Kai, slower, emerged, blinking. His gait had improved. His steps were more confident, more curious. He followed her into the new world, cautious but unafraid. No crowd watched, just Elise, Lani, and Franklin. "They don't look back," Franklin whispered. "They don't have to," Elise said. "They know we're not following." In the first few days, Sable and Kai stayed close to the shelter. They tested the boundaries, but gently. No attempts to climb, no signs of stress. Sable marked territory. Kai sniffed everything. They chased a raven once, dug in the snow, rolled on their backs. They were learning again. Together. And that's when Elise began to rethink the whole idea of freedom. Because if freedom is just space, then yes, this was less. Smaller than the Arctic. Fenced, watched through remote cameras. But if freedom also includes safety, connection, continuity, then maybe this was more. More time. More second chances. More room to be wild without being abandoned. In many ways, it was a model that was gaining traction around the country. Wildlife sanctuaries, real ones, not tourist traps, were rising to fill the space between total captivity and reckless release. Places like the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, where orphaned bears and wolves live protected but not paraded. Or the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado, where large predators, rescued from illegal ownership, roam vast open spaces under the sun unseen by crowds. These aren't compromises. They're acknowledgements. Not all animals can go back, and not all animals should. Because sometimes what we define as returning them to the wild is just sending them to struggle alone and unprepared. And sometimes choosing protection isn't a weakness. It's compassion. It's a different kind of conservation, one not rooted in nostalgia, but in realism. And Sable and Kai were its living, breathing proof. They weren't tame. They weren't dependent. They were wild, but rooted, scarred but steady, and above all, still together. Some nights the trail cams would capture them curled near the tree line. Sable, upright ears alert. Kai pressed against her side, his nose tucked beneath her chest. Other nights, they disappeared into the shadows, only to reappear at dawn, sleepy-eyed and snow-dusted, looking more like themselves than ever before. They were not pets, they were not possessions. They were a mother and child who had been given what few wild creatures ever receive, a second wilderness. It might not be perfect, but it was enough. And in that quiet space where no one called their names and no one asked for anything in return, they were still free. Just a different kind. By midwinter, the sanctuary had settled into rhythm, not a schedule. There were no feeding bells, no training routines, no fixed expectations. Just the natural tempo of the land and the lives that moved through it. The wind reshaped the snowdrifts. The sun hovered low on the horizon for a few quiet hours each day. And somewhere within those muted hours, Sable and Kai roamed. Trail cams picked up their movements. Each morning, Elise would scroll through the footage with a cup of coffee and a pencil, noting patterns. One night, Sable dragged a frozen log toward the shelter, likely to block the wind. Another night, Kai climbed a mound of ice, slipped twice, then made it to the top and sat proudly silhouetted by moonlight. They hunted mice in the underbrush. dug into old fox dens, rolled in the snow like cubs too young to carry history. But the most remarkable footage came without warning. It was around 2:40 a.m. The infrared picked up 2 heat signatures near the southern fence, still pressed close together. Then a third heat signature appeared. A coyote, likely drawn by the scent of old food or territory curiosity. It circled, edged closer. The mother stood first. Sable placed herself between Kai and the threat, not charging, not making sound, just raising to her full height, ears back, breath visible in a slow puff. The coyote paused, took 1 step closer, then Sable lunged. The camera only caught the edge of the sprint, a flash of white, the sharp bark of warning. The coyote turned to tail tucked, vanishing into the tree line. Sable didn't give chase. She returned to Kai, checked him with a nudge, and lay back down. By dawn, they were curled together again beneath the trees. When Elise saw the footage, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she said almost to herself, she's still protecting him. Not because he's weak now, but because that's what love remembers. And that phrase lingered, because by then Kai wasn't fragile anymore. His limp was almost gone, his gait steady. He chased squirrels slowly, clumsily, but with intent. He pulled down branches. He explored alone sometimes for half an hour at a time, but when he returned, Sable was always near. Not calling, not waiting, just there, and he always returned. It became routine, not just their movements, but their bond. They didn't need fences to stay close. They didn't need names spoken aloud to remember who they were. They were wild, yes, but more than that, they were rooted. That's the part no one talks about in wildlife rehabilitation, the difference between release and belonging. Release is a moment. A gate swings open. An animal walks away. We clap. Sometimes we cry. And then it ends. But belonging, that's harder. Belonging means the animal doesn't just survive. It integrates. It remembers where water is, where wind breaks, where danger smells different. Belonging means not being a stranger to the land, even when the land has changed. And Sable and Kai, they belonged. They knew every bend of the trees now, every frozen hollow, every bird call that meant something was coming. They weren't looking to leave. They weren't pacing for escape. They were home in the only way a wild creature can be when it feels unafraid. And their bond, if anything, had grown more refined. Trail cam audio picked up new sounds, short-clipped vocalizations between them. A chirp from Kai, a rumble from Sable, a sequence of grunts, then stillness. Elise brought in an animal behaviorist from Anchorage to listen. Her conclusion was simple: this is patterned. This is not random noise. This is communication, maybe even a dialect. A dialect, not taught, not trained, built. A language between two beings who had once waited on the edge of death together and now were crafting a shared world inside a fence that didn't feel like one. Franklin came to visit that week. He arrived early before the sun had cleared the hills and sat with Elise in the small monitoring cabin. He didn't say much, he never did. Just watched the screen where Sable and Kai appeared dozing in a patch of thawed moss. "She looks older," he said quietly. "She is, and him stronger every day." He took a sip of tea. "Have they ever tried to leave?" "No." "Why not?" Elise paused, then answered, "Maybe because this is the first place they were ever safe." That line stayed with Franklin as he walked the trail near the outer fence. He stopped once, hat in hand, watching two sets of prints in the snow. One small, one large, side by side. He didn't take a picture. He just stood hand over heart and whispered, "Thank you." That afternoon, a group of students from a local conservation club arrived to help with fence repairs. They weren't allowed near the bears, but Elise gave them a short talk. She didn't show them the footage of the rescue. She didn't talk about surgeries or sedation. She told them what Sable had taught her. That wildness isn't just what lives beyond the fence. It's what lives within the heart. That freedom doesn't always mean departure. Sometimes it means return. That connection is not a weakness. That when a mother bear chooses to stay beside her cub despite every instinct to flee, it's not just behavior, it's belief. And when we protect that, when we recognize it, even without fully understanding, we don't just save animals, we save something inside ourselves. Later that week, another snowfall blanketed the enclosure. The trail cams showed Sable and Kai curled in a shallow den they'd dug beneath a windbreak. Elise watched them through the screen, knowing they'd return to that same spot again and again. Because some places once chosen become sacred, not because they were assigned, but because they were earned. And as spring approached, slowly, cautiously, Elise found herself wondering what would happen if one day they didn't come back. If the gate was left open and they chose the forest beyond, would they leave or would they stay? Not out of confinement, but out of choice. Because maybe the truest measure of freedom isn't the absence of walls. Maybe it's the presence of something worth returning to. The last snow came late that year, thick, silent, and unexpected, coating the sanctuary in a soft, unbroken white. It was the kind of snow that swallowed sound and made everything look paused. For a moment, the world seemed to breathe more slowly. Elise was standing on the porch of the monitoring cabin when she saw the first shape. Then the second. Sable and Kai moving through the falling snow like shadows. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. Kai had grown taller. He moved with confidence, now barely limping, his head held higher, but he still stayed close to her. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. They came to the edge of the clearing near the swing Franklin had installed months earlier. Sable circled it once, then lowered herself into the snow. Kai followed, curling beside her. She rested her chin on his shoulder. He pressed his nose into her fur. They didn't know Elise was watching. They didn't know this moment would live on in someone's memory, or maybe be written down later or shared with future interns as the night they came back again. But they came and stayed, and that's what mattered. Because for all the science, for all the tracking devices and blood samples and veterinary charts, for all the theories about instinct and maternal bonds and conservation ethics, nothing could explain why even now, with their enclosure open and no one stopping them, they returned. Again and again. Not as pets, not as captives, but as something more mysterious, beings who had chosen safety, chosen each other, chosen us. And in that choice was the lesson. Not every creature needs to be tamed to feel connected. Not every wild animal needs to be released to feel free. Sometimes devotion is not a cage, it's a path. And what Sable and Kai taught was simple but hard to accept in a world that moves so fast. Love is not just something we give. It's something we recognize. Quietly. Slowly. In the space between what we expect and what happens. Kai had survived. Sable had protected. Elise had chosen not to separate them. And all of it had led here to a mother polar bear curled beside her grown cub beneath falling snow in a sanctuary that wasn't supposed to be permanent, but somehow became home. Elise once said she was supposed to let go. That's what wild animals do. But she didn't, and I think that's why he lived. That one line has become part of how the staff now talks about wildlife rescue. They've updated their protocols, yes, but more than that, they've shifted their mindset. Not every rescue ends with distance. Some end with closeness. Some end with choosing to stay. And maybe that's not just about bears. Maybe it's about us. Because in a time when connection feels harder, when people are spread across cities and screens and silence, there's something powerful about watching a mother polar bear stay beside her injured cub for days in the cold, refusing to flee. There's something even more powerful about watching that cub grow strong and choose to return. We often think the wild is all about survival, but Sable taught that it's also about memory. Wild animals, like people, don't just live by instinct. They live in relationships, they live in patterns of trust, they live in choices, and we're part of those choices whether we admit it or not. Because it was a man like Franklin who stopped on an empty highway just because something didn't feel right. It was a vet like Elise who chose presence over protocol. It was a team of people, quiet, kind, unseen, who rebuilt a space where healing could happen. And in return, 2 polar bears gave us something we rarely receive from the wild, a glimpse of devotion without boundaries. It didn't come with a roar. It didn't come with fanfare. It came in a hum, a quiet sound, a mother's breath near her child, the sound of not giving up. We don't need to romanticize animals to believe in their capacity for emotion. We just need to watch, listen, stay. And when we do, we begin to notice how their stories mirror ours. Sable and Kai aren't just polar bears. They're reminders of resilience, of patience, of love that endures even when the world says it's time to let go. And maybe, just maybe, they're asking something of us too. To slow down, to pay attention, to protect what cannot ask for protection, to return again and again to the places and people who make us feel safe. That's what belonging is. Not geography, not bloodline, not species, just presence. And if 2 polar bears born into ice and silence can teach us that, what might we relearn about ourselves? So as you sit with this story, take a moment. Think of the places where you've been protected, the people who stayed when others left, the moments that softened your fear when things felt lost. And maybe ask yourself, where do you return again and again? That's where your wild heart belongs. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of something you'd forgotten or gave you hope you didn't expect, consider joining this community of quiet protectors. Subscribe for more stories like this, grounded in truth, shaped by wildlife, and driven by a shared belief that love, real love, is worth watching for. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that loyalty still exists, that devotion still breathes even in the coldest places, share this with them. Because somewhere out there, beneath snow or silence or struggle, someone is choosing to stay. And that choice, that's everything.